It's definitely true. I mean, there's a lot of also. This is a big question. I'm only going to be able to answer part of your question, but it's absolutely true. When you sum up a GDP, is that a true number? No. Yeah, it's a construct in that sense that we're trying to get a sense, gauge a sense of what is the economy. But what we have to remember is that for many people, especially of course in the third world, having money. The fact that, for instance, China has lifted 200 million people out of poverty over the last 10 years is hugely important to those 200 million. That's not just a construct, that's an actual and real opportunity. And that actually goes further because it also influences, for instance, the Maldives, which are not particularly poor and are going to be much, much more rich by the end of the century, but still will have a situation where their ability to deal with many of the problems in the world crucially depends on how well off they are. So while I accept your point of saying obviously the GDP, you can't eat GDP, but what you can do with GDP, or as it's a measurement of, is our ability to be robust dealing with problems. And if we start focusing only or focus mostly on cutting carbon emissions and also accept that we're not going to get quite as rich, yes, then we will have bought us a slight insurance policy against climate change policies, but what we'll have failed to obtain is a more rich and robust society. And that's one of the things I think are much more important in the long run. And as I've tried to argue, if you look at some of the issues on cold and heat death, on sea level rise, even on malaria, we do know that matter and probably matter a lot more than what we can do through climate change policies. So at the end of the day, this is not about numbers. This is about people and about the relevance to how well we can serve them and by the end of the century.
I was heavily invested in the biofuel economy, but increasingly the national and international media is attacking biofuels as a poor investment. However, if you talk to researchers in Iowa, we talk, most of them, about the fact that we look at our current biofuel economy as a transitional phase to get us to second generation and to create the infrastructure for the second generation biofuels. What should we be doing differently to help get that message out into the media, to help educate people that we understand some of these issues and are working on solutions, and money is already being spent that way, when the national figures, the national media and the international media is ignoring that aspect of the issue?
Yeah. Now, of course, you're asking me to be a PR person for Iowa, and I'm not quite going to rise to that bait. It is true that second generation biofuels is probably going to be a lot smarter, and we should definitely do that. But my point is, we shouldn't do it before it's actually worthwhile doing. And right now, the first generation biofuels is a disaster. And I'm sorry, but I'm not running for president, so I can get away with saying that, right? But the main point is, it's essentially doing all the wrong things. It's probably causing more CO2 because it's causing deforestation somewhere, not in Iowa, but somewhere else, because there's knock-on effects in the global economy of food production. It's causing dramatically rising food prices, which will probably cause a lot more tens of millions to starve, and it's actually fairly expensive. So it's a three strikes, right? And in a sense, it should be out. The problem here is that I think it's a great example of what happens when you panic. You say, we got to do something. But the point is, no, we got to do smart things, and we got to do things that'll actually work in the long run. And of course, the focus on saying we need to get so much first-generation biofuels out is the reason why it's going to be more hard to get second-generation fuels out. If you'd said, no, we should invest much more in research and development so that second generation will be online sooner, that would have been smart. Let me give you a metaphor or a sort of equivalent in the windmill business. Windmills are big in Denmark. We're a windy country. We're one of the leading exporters of it. We put up lots and lots of windmills in the 70s, 80s, early 90s. We felt incredibly proud about them. They were all bad, right? But the point is, by putting up all these windmills, we also got more and more efficient. And eventually you can have the conversation about are windmills exactly efficient, but they're close to now. So now we've cut down all our 10,000 windmills and put up new and efficient ones. I'm simply saying, maybe we shouldn't have put up all the 10,000 first time around? And it's a little bit the same with biofuel. Now, clearly, you need to put up some windmills in order to keep, you can't just sort of do it all in the lab. You do need demonstration models. But clearly, you might need 1, you might need 10, you might even need 100, but you don't need 1,000 or 10,000. And that's the point. You should keep it on the demonstration level until it's efficient. That's the point. Because in that way, we're saying we're spending your tax money well. We're using it to get further ahead instead of just buying a lot of the stuff right now, as for instance with biofuels, but also with windmills. And that way we know we'll get there sooner to the real solution, and we won't get the backlash when people start realizing, whoa, this is just costing me a lot of money, and why am I spending all that money on stuff that actually doesn't solve the problem? So really we got to get back to the basics and say, how do we actually spend our money smartly, and how do we make sure that we don't just waste it on things that look good, but honestly don't do all that much good?
There are several assumptions that you made, and I'm going to challenge them.
It sounded that way, yes.
First assumption you made is that the sea level is going to rise by 1 foot and not 20 foot. You don't know that. I don't know that. There's nobody on Earth who knows that, because it all depends on whether or not Greenland melts much faster than IPCC projected. And the evidence in the last few years is that Greenland is melting a lot faster than IPCC projected. We got to worry about that, because if Greenland melts, that's 20 feet. We also have to worry about a major ice shelf breaking off the Antarctica. That's probably less likely than Greenland melting, but we got to worry about potential catastrophes. So reducing global warming, reducing carbon dioxide emission would certainly lower, we hope, the rate of melting of Greenland. And it's like buying insurance policy. I don't buy fire insurance, because I expect my house to go up in flames, but I can't afford to have it go up in flames. So I'm prepared to pay $500 a year for that. The second assumption you made is that Kyoto, $180 billion, that is based on a static technology. That's simply not true. I'll give an example. There are refineries in the world. Refineries in America use 7.5% of the total energy consumption in the United States, 7.5% just for refined petroleum. There are refineries in the world which are twice as efficient producing the same product as some of the refineries in the United States, or the older refineries in the United States, and certainly in India and China, which are actually the most efficient refinery in the world is a new Indian refinery, which is twice as efficient as the average. So reducing carbon emission is not uneconomical. Actually, it can be very economical provided you start using the right technology. And very fortunately, the price of oil going from $10 or $20 a barrel to $120 has done wonders. Is probably going to be a major technological change which is going to assist in our reducing our carbon emission through the economic means, not because of government mandate, not because of Kyoto.
Yep. There are several good points there. The first one is you say, you don't know, I don't know. No, that's exactly true. That's why we have the UN Climate Panel. I don't know what your expertise is, but I would actually also challenge you and say, you don't know whether the last couple of years have told us that the IPCC is dramatically off, because that's exactly the amount of information that the IPCC has also had. The discussion here is, yes, there are researchers that tell us, and reputable researchers that tell us it could be more than the 59 centimeters, which is the upper limit of the UN Climate Panel. But there are also researchers that are telling us that it's going to be below that. The problem is we only hear one side of that story. But your other argument with that is to say you buy insurance. That's absolutely true. Let's just remember this is not insurance we're talking about, because with insurance you get your money back. Of course, you wouldn't actually get your money back if a catastrophe happened. What you're buying is increased effort to deal with the problem. It's a reduction of the risk, in essence. But the point, of course, is you buy a fire insurance if it costs $500 and give you the whole price of the house back. You do not buy a fire insurance if it costs twice the amount of the cost of the house, but only gives you the door back if it burns, right? And that's the discussion that I'm having. It really is a question of saying how much does it cost and how much does it reduce the risk of what you get. So I absolutely agree with you that you have to take that discussion into account, but you also have to realize that certainly the implementations that we're doing right now would have very, very little bearing on what would come out, for instance, of climate impacts by the end of the century. Now, it's true that the $180 billion is based on reasonable assumptions of what will happen into the future. So if we do more, and of course that's the exact argument that I'm making, if we invest more in research and development, it will get cheaper. But let's not fool ourselves. We're talking about 25, 50 years. We're not talking about next year or the next 10 years that we can dramatically change the cost of, unless there's something, great invention that neither of us have heard of that would suddenly come along. And so what it points out is, yes, we need to invest dramatically more in research and development, but let's also remember, and this is one of the great untolds of much of what we see from the UN Climate Panel and the whole scenario business behind. I don't know how many have heard of the wedges approach, the idea that we need to stabilize, in order to stabilize, we need to cut out some wedges. We talk about 7 wedges of the increase that we're otherwise going to see in the emissions. But what we fail to remember is that those emission scenarios that we're seeing into the future have already assumed that we are getting incredibly much better by 2050 and dramatically incredibly much better by 2100. Most people, you can just, if the wedge is just simply as a measurement of how hard it is to get to stabilization, if the 7 wedges are what we're talking about, what is implicit in all of these scenarios is somewhere between 20 and 30 wedges. So our technology is already assumed to solve many of these problems. Undoubtedly, they will. Yes, a high oil price will definitely do some of this. Let's just remember a dramatically increase in oil price has a huge number of very, very bad side effects, especially for the world's poor. But yes, in that particular aspect, it definitely will. But the point is, if it does have that impact, we don't have to need to worry about that part of it. What I think is the conversation that I'm trying to engage in is simply to say, what extra policy measures should we take over and above what the market will do? And I think we need to do that, because the market is not going to get us all the while there. But we need to be smart about it. And so in that sense, I hope I've answered some of your reflections.
Who had the question? Oh, I covered your question.
At the beginning of your presentation, you said that global warming is man-made, and the only person that I've actually seen data from it is Al Gore's, Inconvenient Truth documentary. And I just wanted to know if you use his same information that he has, or what makes you think that it's man-made? Is my question.
Yes. Well, I don't think we should listen to a random professor from Denmark, and I don't think we should listen to a journalist and former vice president of the U.S. as great informants in this, right? Obviously, and that's why I'm saying we should listen to the UN Climate Panel. This is not a perfect body. Nothing is, right? But it's it's the best we've managed to do so far in getting a lot of really, really smart people together in a lot of different fields and trying to talk about what happens when you increase CO2 contents in the atmosphere. And what they're basically telling us that the basic science is very, very simple. All other things equal, more carbon in the atmosphere means higher temperatures. Now, a lot extra happens after that, and a lot of this is model-based. You can have serious discussions, and they have, of just how much warmer it's going to get. And the standard way of looking at it is, if we doubled the CO2 content in the atmosphere, how much warmer would it get? And the answer is, it could get somewhere from 1.5 degrees centigrade up to 4.5 degrees. So it's a pretty wide span, and we don't actually really know within that span, but we do know it's going to get warmer. And so the point is here, we do know that there is a significant amount of warming in the horizon if we keep putting out a lot of CO2. We don't know exactly how much. The other thing you have to remember is we don't know what else happens, because obviously many other things happen. In Denmark, we have some of the leading solar researchers that argue that the sun is arguably much more important. This is, should be pointed out, is a very minority view right now. And that's why I'm saying, we've got to go with the best science that we have right now, which is telling us this is what's going to happen. But we should definitely fund other people to realize whether there are other and possibly more important parts. Is it such that the sun just trends around what the CO2 does, or is it such that the CO2 just trends around what the sun does? That's important in the long run future. But right now, what we know is more CO2 means extra temperature.
Hi.
Hi.
As a healthcare professional for a long time and studying economics, I appreciate the focus that you have on some of these issues. And I'm not all for subsidizing, ethanol at our current level of development and production.
Ooh. So you're not running either.
So I'm not, but I do have some. I think your argument could be stronger if we think about all the different kinds of environmental degradation. If 70% of the poverty in the world, 70% of the impoverished people in the world that are most affected by these issues you point out live in rural areas and depend on a lot of subsistence and other forms of agriculture. And environmental degradation affects them more than any other people in the world. They're the most susceptible to AIDS. The reason they can't provide micronutrients is because some of their agriculture insufficiencies and that. I was wondering if some of the economists and people you had in the Copenhagen Consensus evaluated the impact of some of the ways that modern industry and the use of environmental resources that creates the kind of degradation and things that affect these people most. I mean, if we could fix some of the problems that are affected, we would be addressing AIDS and micronutrient malnutrition and some of these issues. So there is kind of a reverse impact that I wondered, if the economists focused on and developed some numbers that. I think we make a mistake. I think people, when they consider global warming, they're considering not just the temperature change, but all sorts of environmental degradation, and I think that's what the focus is. So.
Yeah,
that's my question.
And the answer, of course, is always going to be slightly dissatisfying in the sense that it's just very, very hard to get people to cross boundaries. I mean, if you knew how much I have to slap these economists around to just get them to do some of this, as you're mentioning, because everybody feels like if I'm in education, why should I worry about the fact that possibly HIV is the most important factor in not causing people to get educated? Or the other way around, if you actually did something about education, maybe you'd lower HIV rates. And the interactions are huge potentially, but typically you work within your silo, and that's what you mainly think about. But let me just give you a sense of proportion, at least. Two things, I think. One is that we're talking about marginal change, that is, how much on the margin could we change? Now, it may be that global warming is a big problem, but if we can do very little about it, that, I would argue, is the important part. We have this saying in the Copenhagen Consensus that if you ask, and journalists will typically do that, ask me to rank, what's the most important problem in the world? Well, you can't do that because it doesn't make sense unless you have good solutions. I mean, arguably the biggest problem in the world is that we all die. But we don't have good technologies to avoid that, right? So the argument is, what can we actually do? And I would argue on global warming parts, there's very little we can do for many of these issues. But just to give you a sense of proportion, because some of these things I know, a lot of things of what you talk about I don't, unfortunately. But I would argue probably the biggest environmental problem in the world is a problem we don't talk about at all. It's indoor air pollution. Yeah. The U.S. EPA estimate that the biggest industrial air pollution problem is outdoor air pollution. Most people don't seem to know this, but in the U.S. we estimate that from particulate pollution in outdoor air pollution, about 110,000 Americans die each year. The EPA estimates somewhere between 86 and 96% of all social benefits from all environmental regulation comes from regulating particulate air pollution. So in many senses, I would argue that likewise, it's reasonable to assume that even stronger so, indoor air pollution, many of the third world countries, is by far the most important environmental problem. It kills about 1 million people every year, especially women and children, and unlike most other environmental problems, it kills people fairly young so that they lose a lot of years of life. And the solution there, of course, is very, very clear. It's not about, the reason why, many of us have totally forgotten, 100 years ago, our homes were incredibly dirty because we used dirty fuels. We don't today. But of course, in many third world countries, use whatever you can get, both wood, which causes deforestation, but also cardboard and dung and whatever you can find. And of course, the point is, it's not about regulating environmentally dung or something, but it's about making sure that people get rich enough to get kerosene. So I would argue, again, and this of course is sort of a standard economic tack, to say that many of these problems are much better served by, if people get sufficiently well off, they'll be able to deal with many of these problems. We know that's true for malaria. We know that's true for indoor air pollution and a number of these other problems. So that, I would argue, is a much better way if you actually care about some of these environmental problems in the local area in the third world, to make sure that these people actually get sufficiently well off. One of the ways, of course, would be to allow for competition, both in agricultural areas, but also in textiles and many other areas where they have a comparative advantage.
Great. This will be our last question. Dr. Lomborg will be available afterwards for questioning in the book signing area.
The entire premise of this question is probably going to seem controversial to some people, but I think it's hard to deny that Al Gore plays kind of loose with the facts in his movie. You mentioned the 20-foot sea level rise, and somebody challenged you about that, obviously. I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is the fact, the graph he has with the CO2 level and the temperature through history. He just completely neglects to mention that the relationship between those two lines is the other way around, and that the CO2 increases and decreases were actually following the temperature increases. That's the kind of omission, I think, that you have to make an active choice to make. I mean, to leave out that kind of a detail. I guess what I'm getting at is, do you think the IPCC does damage to its integrity by identifying with someone like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. The bottom line, I mean, my sense is Al Gore is truly and honestly motivated by a good cause. I mean, let's face it, he's been talking about global warming for so many years when nobody thought it was a cool thing to do, and enjoyed quite a bit of being bullied and pitied and many other things. So you got to give the man credit for this, and I think it's also very clear he's not presenting a disinterested view in this. He's telling us sort of the most upbeat way that he could present this, and I think, yes, it's absolutely right. There's nothing that's wrong in the movie, or there are very, very few things that are wrong in the movie. He actually says the correlation between the CO2 and the temperature is very complex, but the outcome is this, that we know that as CO2 increases, we're going to see dramatic increases in temperature, which is true. But again, it's very misleading. One of my friends whom I did some of this stuff with, he looked at Al Gore's graph and said, oh yeah, if this has been our argument, we'd have loved it, but we wouldn't have shown it because it's just simply too, it's too wrong. So I think there is a certain threshold that he's stepped over in order to wanting to tell people this is a big issue and failing to sort of curb in what is a reasonable argument. Is IPCC damaging its integrity? I think it is, but I actually don't think it's predominantly because of Al Gore. It's much more the fact that the IPCC, both is a very, very reputable science organization that tries to compile the best information there is on virtually all sides of this data issue, and they do that. They do as good a job as I could imagine anyone do. But the top officials, especially Steiner from UNEP and Pachauri, who is the head of the IPCC, are also activists, and sometimes you can't even hear the difference between activists and the IPCC, although the IPCC in its charter says that they're policy neutral. The top people are definitely going for a specific policy solution, namely cutting carbon emissions dramatically. And I think they are damaging their ability to advise policymakers if we know that they also have a hidden agenda, which is that there's one solution that's much better than other solutions. Now, I understand why they've gotten there, but I think it's to their damage. I mean, I should just make a disclaimer. Pachauri, the head of the IPCC, compared me to Hitler because I dared to say whether it's the right priority to make. And you always know people in trouble if they have to do that. But the main point, I think, is that they could do better if they were being more honest about saying there are many different policy opportunities for this. What we're doing is we're providing the evidence to give you good judgments as to what kinds of policies and the effects of the different policies that you want to choose. I think we'd be better off, but this is not a perfect world. I still think we should listen to the IPCC. I think we should be happy that Al Gore has pointed out that global warming is real, but I think we also end up possibly paying a high price if we end up all being too scared. We end up spending a lot of money ill-advisedly and actually end up doing less good, both about global warming, but also many other issues that we need to fix. In that sense, it's to our own detriment. But hey, that's why we have a democracy. That's why we can have this conversation. And ultimately, I hope that's why we'll end up being smarter on this issue and hopefully be able to tackle it. All right, thank you.
Great. We'd like to remind you to join us for a reception and also a book signing in the South Ballroom. Thanks, guys.
Of course.
Please join me for also giving another round of applause for our guest speaker, Bjorn Lomborg.
What
Trevor Brown.
Just his first name.
Trevor. Trevor, T-R-U-E-V-O-R.
T-R.
E-V-O-R. Yes.
There you go.
Thank you.
Yes. I just want to make. Yes, I just want to make sure.
Jeannie, you're the computer.